But I think the critical point to draw out for me is that when we hear that Total has made $6 billion in profit in just 3 months, which is roughly 68% higher than what they made in the same period last year, the first question that we are confronted by and that we should ask is, where does that money actually come from? Because by all means, it was not created by executives sitting in boardrooms, under nice air conditioning and in fancy leather chairs, nor was that money pulled out of thin air. It wasn't pulled from nothing. But profit is indeed the portion of wealth produced by workers that they themselves do not receive back in wages, right? So Total's workers produce, they extract, they transport, they refine, and they sell far more value than they are paid for. The difference in that value that is sold is then taken by the company, and it is distributed upwards to its executives and to shareholders, and that is the essence of their profits, right? But even that does not capture the full picture, because Total's profits also depend on pushing enormous costs onto everyone else, right? So communities, as we've seen in the case of EACOP, communities lose their livelihoods, workers carry the risks of production, the general public carries the cost of pollution, of climate destruction, and of social breakdown. And in most cases, across almost all capitalist countries in the neo-colonial world, the public also carries the cost of guaranteeing profits to private companies through, public-private partnerships and these sorts of deals and arrangements. And of course, like comrades have correctly pointed out, the public also carries the cost of geopolitical tensions and of war, the cost of living crisis, of course, that we are confronted by skyrockets in our fuel prices, in the prices of our food, and all manner of other things, all while Total keeps the revenue. And ordinary people, in very real ways, in very real terms, made to pay the real price. Um, you know, of that. And we see this very clearly, comrades, along the route of the East African crude oil pipeline. Of course, while executives and shareholders celebrate what is for them another profitable quarter, affected communities, as we have heard, continue to confront the harsh conditions brought about by land loss, inadequate compensation, the destruction and unraveling of their livelihoods, and in turn, food insecurity and all of the kind of social ills and conditions that flow from it. And indeed, also confronting conditions of increased militarization and surveillance and repression, where families that once had survived from their land have been left far more vulnerable and far more dependent, in some cases, even forced and pushed into the formal economy, or at least to compete for jobs, limited and sparse jobs within the formal economy, where previously families would have been able to keep a roof over their head and put food on the table. And of course, we see, organizers, students, community leaders, all, kinds of activists and ordinary people who have challenged the ECO project have faced all kinds of intimidation, surveillance, arrest, detention, for incredibly lengthy periods as well. But the point I'm making is that these profits are not a neutral business achievement, and it's important that we understand that point. They are not neutral. They are, if anything, an account of organized exploitation, though of course organized exploitation is entirely legal under capitalism, but still it is effectively an admission of robbery when a company like Total announces record profits of this nature. Those profit margins tell us how successful Total has been in converting the labor of workers, converting community land, public resources, and environmental destruction into private wealth that it shares amongst its executives and its shareholders. And I think that's, for me, the most politically useful and important point to put across in the context of these record profits being announced by Total today in the form of the 6 billion USD for quarter two. But to conclude And to your question, Abud, on the question of the Stop EACOP campaign, the question of accountability, and really, I think what the near completion of the East African crude oil pipeline means for us, um, uh, we quite simply reject the idea that just because construction has advanced, that the struggle is somehow over. I mean, EACOP's own proponents, of course, now report that the pipeline is around 88% complete. But importantly for us is our assertion that construction does not erase responsibility. In fact, the corporation does not escape accountability simply because the damage has already been inflicted or because a project becomes operational. It is the opposite. It, if anything, makes the accountability phase of the campaign even more important. And so we will continue, of course, in our work in supporting communities, fighting for remedy, for compensation, and for justice. We'll continue documenting the project's impacts and challenging attempts to rewrite the experience of affected people. Continue pursuing legal and regulatory avenues, confronting the financiers and the investors who are enabling Total, and of course, exposing the gap between the company's public promises and the reality of ordinary people on the ground. In addition to that, and at the risk of sounding somewhat contradictory, I think we must also challenge the narrative of inevitability here. Because Total does want people to believe that once sufficient money has been invested and enough construction has taken place, that resistance then becomes pointless. But of course, we know that projects remain vulnerable to public scrutiny, um, to legal action, to financial pressure, to political opposition, and of course, and centrally, to organized community resistance, throughout the lifespan and existence of that project. And our struggle has always been about more than stopping one pipeline. It is also about challenging a model of so-called development in which corporations extract wealth from Africa, where governments protect the investments of those corporations and further the interests of capital generally, and communities are then expected to accept dispossession and precarity and poverty, simply so that Total shareholders can rejoice as they are in their record profits. We of course also know and have maintained that the EACOP is designed to open up the entirety of the East African region to exploration and exploitation. And of course, we're already beginning to see that take shape in different ways and different forms. And so it is, of course, in our interest to escalate the fight against all of the associated projects and the parasitic expansion of oil extraction in East Africa in general. And so, not to belabor the point, but to move towards conclusion, I would simply like to invite, journalists, researchers, policymakers, and everyone who is listening to look beyond the headline figure of Total's record profits. We need to be asking who produced that wealth, who is receiving that wealth. We need to ask who has been forced to bear the cost of the production of that wealth. And the answers, I think, are quite striking when we follow the experiences of affected communities in the case of the East African crude oil pipeline, and when we scrutinize Total's claims and continue asking the questions that the company otherwise would prefer are simply left to be forgotten. And so while Total's profits may dominate the business headlines today, it is our responsibility to make sure that the workers and communities whose exploitation made those profits possible are not written out of the story. In fact, they sit at the very heart of it. And that really is our contention here today.